A whisper of betrayal echoed through a room no one ever entered. A silent move made on a chessboard of nations, where even loyalty could be forged like ink. Somewhere between a vanished map and a man too quiet to be harmless, a danger unfolded in perfect silence. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was one of those grey London mornings when even the gas lamps seemed reluctant to burn and the fog curled at the window panes like a cat unsure of entry. I remember it particularly well, not because of the weather, which was unremarkable for February, but for the absence of Holmes' violin. In its place lay silence, dense, deliberate, and most unlike the irregular melodies that usually accompanied his breakfastless mornings. My companion sat cross-legged upon the floor, surrounded by a semicircle of sprawling maps and battered atlases. A magnifying lens rested in his right hand, while his left moved occasionally to adjust a compass or inspect the margin of a page. I had seen Holmes in states of abstraction before, but this was something more narrowed, more intense. Not a word had passed between us in over an hour. It was the kind of silence that, in Baker Street, always preceded a visitor or a revelation. I cleared my throat once or twice, though even I could not say whether to summon Holmes or my own courage. His gaze remained fixed on a page depicting the mountain passes between Peshawar and Jalalabad. Beside him, notes had been scribbled in tight columns, all in his own eccentric shorthand. On the hearthrug, a pair of his shoes stood facing one another precisely, toe to toe, as if waiting to be worn on some military errand. There was a palpable intensity to him, and though I longed to interrupt, something in his posture suggested it would be a tactical error. The knock, when it came, was soft, too soft for the brassy fist of a tradesman or the hesitant hand of a lady. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, her apron dusted with flour. "There's a gentleman, sir," she said. "Won't give his name. Says he has business of the confidential sort." Holmes did not look up. "Show him in." The man who entered did so with precision, not hurried, not hesitant. He wore a dark coat of respectable tailoring, but his eyes flicked once to Holmes and then took in the room as though measuring it for exits. The first thing I noticed was his cane, ebony, polished to a degree almost unnatural, with a silver wolf's head handle. He leaned on it not for support, but to anchor himself like a man accustomed to false terrain. His boots, though unremarkable at first glance, bore the faintest imprint of dried mud around the instep. Mud of a red clay variety I'd last seen during our campaign near Helmond. Holmes glanced only once at the man's shoes, once at his collar, and then, at last, met his eyes. Without a word, the visitor reached into his coat and drew forth a folded slip of paper, which he extended silently. Then, to my mild alarm, he stepped backward and turned the key in our sitting room door. Holmes took the paper. "You may speak freely. The walls are no better at keeping secrets than men." Holmes unfolded the note and read it in silence. The corners of his mouth did not rise, but his eyes sharpened, and I detected that minute contraction of the brow, which to him was the equivalent of an exclamation. He folded the paper once more and slipped it into his pocket. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious. The railway line runs through Surrey, but this implies a deviation not found on any official survey." He stood suddenly, his mood no longer abstract. "Watson," he said, "we may soon find that a map is not merely a guide to where one is going, but to whom." The man, having secured the door, stood quite still for a moment, as though listening to the silence he had just entered. Then, in a voice which bore the faintest Midlands inflection, he said, "My name is Rivington, Oswald Rivington. I am a mechanical engineer by trade." Holmes, who had remained standing, offered no greeting. "And yet it is not trade that brings you here, but treason, or something adjacent to it." Rivington flinched, though his features betrayed more exhaustion than alarm. "I hope not, sir. he replied, though I fear you are not entirely wrong. I rarely am, said Holmes. Please sit, and speak plainly, Mr. Rivington. Time and fog are both thick this morning, and I dislike clutter in either. The man took the chair opposite mine, though he did not relax into it. He sat stiffly, like a man who expected a blow, but could not yet locate the direction from which it might come. I came to you, Mr. Holmes, because I'm not certain whether I'm losing my mind or something more precious. Such as? Holmes prompted. My professional integrity, possibly my life. He leaned forward, clasping his hands between his knees. I have been working for the past 7 months on a civil proposal, a railway design intended to connect several secondary depots in the southeast. The official plans are lodged with the ministry, of course, but I maintained a personal rendering, coded and partial, drawn entirely in my own cipher for my own reference, a map known to no one but myself. Yet you believe it has been altered, Holmes said calmly. I know it has, Rivington replied. 3 nights ago, I examined it after a particularly trying day. A corner had been clipped from the lower edge. As with a blade, the ink, my own, had been retouched in 2 segments. And the cipher? Holmes asked. Unchanged, but I suspect someone has deciphered it and modified what they now understand. Watson could not help but interject. Surely such changes could only be noticed by the man who created it. Rivington gave a tight nod. Precisely. That is why I fear the enemy is not only close, but intimate. Yesterday morning, Rivington continued, I returned to my room after a short walk. I had taken the air to steady myself, for the matter had begun to weigh heavily upon me. When I returned, I found a single black pawn from a chess set lying upon my pillow. Holmes raised one eyebrow. Black, you say? Not white. Black. Holmes folded his fingers beneath his chin. And you have never played chess in your room? No, nor do I own a set, nor does the boarding house provide one. Then someone is sending a message, Holmes said. A threat disguised as a courtesy. The pawn is the weakest piece, but also the most numerous. Its sacrifice means little to the one who commands the board. Rivington swallowed. That is what I feared. A sensible fear, Holmes said. But perhaps not your first. Tell me now, Mr. Rivington, what exactly have you been running from? Holmes rose then, and slowly began to circle our visitor like a thoughtful vulture. He paused briefly behind the man's left shoulder, then leaned over to adjust the cuff of Rivington's shirt. You dress plainly, Holmes observed, but the linen is Swiss, the polish military grade, and the soles of your boots are stitched by hand in a method reserved for club uniformers on Brook Street. Holmes ignored the protest. Furthermore, your cane is not ornamental. It's weighted near the base, the kind used by those who expect trouble and prefer not to be surprised by it. Rivington flushed. I thought I should be prepared. You were once more than an engineer, Holmes said softly, almost to himself. More than a draftsman. I cleared my throat. You said you work on railway proposals, yet Mr. Holmes is clearly implying that our friend here has spent time under false pretenses, Holmes finished, and that the pawn left on his pillow is but a polite echo of something far darker. Rivington dropped his gaze. I did not lie, he murmured. I simply left out the parts that no longer apply. Your collar, Holmes said, was recently pressed by a valet unfamiliar with your jacket size. Your cuffs are half an inch shorter than the shirt beneath. That tells me you borrowed your outerwear, or more likely, changed quickly after visiting somewhere where civilian dress is frowned upon. A club, perhaps. Rivington said nothing. Not a gentleman's club, Holmes continued, but military, one of the smaller establishments near Victoria Embankment. You have the faint smell of cavalry boot grease and Havana tobacco. Am I correct? Yes, Rivington said quietly. The Royal Cormorant Club. I was once attached to it. As what? Consulting engineer during the Afghan campaign. I blinked. You were in Kabul? Rivington nodded. I was attached to a private armaments firm. We worked under government commission. Strategic rail planning, forward logistics, and depot camouflage, all on maps that were never meant to exist. And now one of them has re-emerged, Holmes concluded. In your handwriting, altered. Not just altered, Rivington said grimly. Redirected to somewhere vulnerable. Holmes returned to his chair, his eyes unreadable. So you see, Watson, he said. The game is not played with pawns alone, but with tunnels, engines, and the minds of forgotten engineers. I kept quiet, Rivington said after a long pause. After Kabul, I withdrew from all government work. My employer, Rotherham and Gray, was implicated in a procurement scandal, though I was never named. Still, I resigned. Holmes studied him without expression. I never took money, but I knew, Rivington said. I knew something was wrong with the contracts, with the ghost depots they insisted I route toward. I knew, and I said nothing. And now someone has resurrected your designs, Holmes murmured. Not to build, but to break. Rivington's voice cracked slightly. If someone is trying to lead our military into a trap using my lines, my code, I must stop it. But I don't know who they are, or how they knew. Only that the pawn was left, and the ink has changed. Holmes steepled his fingers. Do you still have the original draft? Yes. I shall need to see it. And your boarding house. Tonight. Rivington reached for his wallet. Holmes waved him off. No fee, Mr. Rivington, he said. I never charge when the pieces are already moving. He turned to me then. Watson, I trust your revolver is in order. I suspect we shall need it before the week is out. The fog was still clinging to the London pavements when Holmes and I made our way to the boarding house on Upper Montague Street, where Mr. Oswald Rivington kept his lodgings. Holmes had said little on the journey, save for one cryptic remark about clumsily rearranged shadows, which I presumed was a reference to forgery or espionage, though I knew better than to ask directly. The boarding house itself was a narrow, respectable structure, with ivy choking its left side, and an air of studied forgettability that seemed, in this case, a deliberate virtue. The landlady, a pale, tight-lipped woman of uncertain age, greeted us with the suspicion common to those who have long rented rooms to secrets rather than guests. She led us up 2 creaking flights to Rivington's quarters and left us there with a whispered warning that the walls were thin and the gentleman in the room above disliked disturbances. Holmes paused at the threshold before entering. Watson, he said softly, note the air. A house is never so silent as when it listens. I confess, I did not understand him then, but within moments, I would. Holmes moved through Rivington's room, not as a man examining quarters, but as one reading an unfamiliar dialect in a book he had nonetheless studied before. His eyes scanned the skirting boards, the bureau, the curtains, and the very texture of the air, while I remained respectfully still, too accustomed to his methods to interrupt them with the burdens of small talk. Curious, he murmured, crouching beside the hearth. With his handkerchief he collected a faint grey smear just beneath the coal grate. This ash is finer than the house coal would produce, and drier than what remains from Rivington's own fire. Turkish tobacco, perhaps, but note the angle, deliberately left, where a seated man's boot would not reach. I stepped closer and pointed to the window. The latch is crooked. Indeed, Holmes said, now turning his attention to it. Someone opened it recently, but left the dust disturbed. The sill has the faintest pressure mark. A hand bracing the frame from within. Not from Rivington, though. Too high. And, here. He moved to the carpet and bent low. See this faint mark? A shoe print dragging slightly at the heel. Left foot heavier than the right. Our visitor has a limp. He stood slowly. Watson, what is the only thing quieter than a criminal? I don't follow. Holmes smiled thinly. A criminal who knows you're listening. At Holmes's request, we returned downstairs and asked the landlady, Mrs. Grable, as she reluctantly introduced herself, whether any other boarders had recently moved in. "Just the one, sir," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Came about 10 days ago, quiet as winter milk. Scottish by the sound of him. Keeps odd hours. I've never seen him out during daylight." "May we have his name?" Holmes inquired. She looked uncomfortable. "Well, he gave it as Mr. Angus Grant. Said he was a writer, never asks for anything, always keeps to himself. But I'll say this, sir. He pays in coin I've not seen since my late brother came home from Egypt. Gold sovereigns, but foreign mint. I can tell by the edge." Holmes glanced at me. "And does Mr. Grant ever receive callers?" "Not that I know of. Once I heard voices, speaking low, in some language I didn't know. But when I came up with the tea tray, there was no one there." Holmes smiled with a peculiar satisfaction. "Mrs. Grable," he said, "you may well be housing a man whose pen writes in more than ink." Holmes had not been long in the room before his fingers, ever restless, reached into the ash of the sitting-room grate and drew out a crumpled edge of singed paper, its edges blackened, but its centre still intact. He sniffed it delicately, then turned it against the light and studied the texture with quiet absorption. "This was meant to be destroyed," he said, but the fire was half-hearted, as if the burner feared too much smoke. "Can you make it out?" I asked, leaning closer. "There is nothing legible, but the ink." "Ah, the ink, Watson. That is a different matter." He reached into his coat for a small vial, dabbing the edge of the paper with the fluid. A trace of deep violet began to reappear. "Korak black," he murmured. "Ottoman-made. Used in diplomatic correspondence and naval charts. Quite illegal to possess in England. I last encountered it in a boarding house in Varna during a very quiet December." His eyes narrowed slightly, and he tucked the fragment into his pocket. "Either our visitor brought it with him," he said at last, "or someone from across the Bosphorus has learned to write in London's silence." That afternoon, we made our way to the industrial offices of Brigham and Rivington Engineering, a modest but well-regarded establishment in Clerkenwell, known for its involvement in logistical and structural design for the army supply chain. Rivington had arranged for us to be received discreetly, and we were greeted by a clerk in his late 20s, thin, pale, and too well groomed for a draftsman. Holmes said little as he glanced about the drafting tables and neatly stacked archives, but I noted the faint way his brows tightened the moment the young man offered his hand. "You use glycerin soap?" Holmes said casually. The man hesitated. "Yes, sir, for my skin." "Indeed. And yet I don't see a single ink stain on your fingers." "I prefer pencil, sir." Holmes smiled without humour. "Of course you do." We were shown to Rivington's corner, and Holmes wandered absently, then stopped near a filing cabinet. "You have access to metallurgical records?" he asked the clerk. "I occasionally assist with inventory." "Then you are doubtless familiar with the standard ratios used in heat-resistant alloys for Turkish rail designs." The clerk blinked. "Why Turkish, sir?" Holmes cocked his head. "Because only someone who had read their schematics carefully would recognize the subtle shift from chromium to molybdenum in their newer sets." The man stammered something unintelligible. "Your hands," Holmes continued, "are the hands of a violinist or a diplomat, not an engineer. And your cufflink, which you attempted to conceal, bears the double eagle of Belgrade's consular corps." The man grew very still. Holmes did not confront him further, but his interest, I could tell, had moved from map to man. We left the premises shortly thereafter, and it was only once we were again in the hansom cab that Holmes began to speak freely. "That man," he said, "is not who he pretends to be. He's no more a clerk than I am a curate. You recognised him?" "Not at first, but the voice, the coin, the cufflink, they were sufficient." He tapped his cane against the floor. "He was known in Constantinople as Dragan Radovich, though I believe he now calls himself Anton Gregor. A shadow of the Balkan court system, attached unofficially to their naval archive. He vanished from Smyrna following an inquiry into leaked depot codes along the Danube. And now he resurfaces in Clerkenwell, I murmured. Holmes nodded, working beside a man who once drafted a railway skeleton across half the Empire's eastern flank. Rivington's past has caught up with him, though I dare say he was never meant to recognise its face. You intend to expose him? Not yet. The clerk is a pawn, Watson, and pawns never move alone. He settled back, arms crossed, his eyes fixed not on the street ahead, but on something far beyond it. Holmes grew uncharacteristically quiet during the return journey. I had seen him in such moods before, neither irritable nor aloof, but deeply preoccupied, as though conducting a chess match entirely within the theatre of his own skull. He withdrew a leather-bound notepad from his inner coat pocket and began to sketch, not quickly, but with the slow, deliberate precision of a man charting not just position, but intent. Topography, I ventured. Something like that. May I? He shook his head without looking up. Not yet, Watson. Outside, the city passed by in slow monochrome. Chimney smoke, tired policemen, the unspoken industry of London's undercurrent. Within, Holmes began humming a march I recognised faintly from our days in Kandahar, one reserved for logistical brigades. I studied his face as he worked, unreadable, pale, focused not on the pad in his hand, but on a mental structure only he could inhabit. When he finally closed the notebook, he slipped it back into his coat without comment. I believe, he said, almost cheerfully, that we are several moves into the middle game. And the board? I asked. He smiled. Is larger than Rivington ever suspected. Holmes waited until nightfall before requesting that Rivington produce the map in question. We had returned to Baker Street, and I found myself oddly restless, as though the stillness of the fog earlier that day had followed us indoors. Holmes, by contrast, had entered one of his noiseless moods, a sign, I had learned, that something in his mind had connected where none of the rest of us yet saw the thread. When Rivington laid the paper before him, Holmes's hands moved with unusual delicacy. He produced 2 vials from the chemical cabinet by the window and moistened a linen cloth with a precise solution whose odour was both acrid and faintly floral. You have your original ink formula on hand? He asked. Rivington nodded and withdrew a small phial. Holmes compared the old against the new with a meticulousness that bordered on reverence. Then he stood, stepped back, and gestured for us to observe. Under the reagent, 3 junction points on the map had changed tone, a shade too warm, a shimmer too glossy. He tapped one with his finger. This line now leads, he said, not to the storage depot at Milden Heath, but to a decommissioned outpost north of Crouch End. It is defenceless, a ghost site. But why alter it? I asked. Holmes turned to me. Because misdirection, Watson, is far more dangerous than theft. Rivington leaned forward and ran his hand over the ink as though touching the work of a phantom. It's my script, he said quietly. The angle of the lettering, the curve of the uppercase, down to the pressure points. Even the spacing mimics how I draft when fatigued. Then you see the danger, Holmes replied. This was not taken from you. It was copied, with care. But who could have? Someone with access not to your materials, but your mind, your style, your reflex, perhaps even your discarded notes. The forger is not merely literate in cartography. They are fluent in you. Rivington blanched. Then I have no way to prove the forgery. On the contrary, Holmes said, the evidence lies in the flaws. A man may copy another's hand, but not his history. There is no error here, and that, paradoxically, is the error. He gestured again toward the altered junction. This section connects to no water source, no coal intake. A real engineer would have corrected that in revision. And our forger, Holmes's smile was thin, knew just enough to deceive, and no more. That evening, Holmes placed the black pawn, retrieved from Rivington's pillow, upon the mantelpiece and studied it with something bordering on amusement. He turned it in his hand several times before producing a small magnifying disc and peering closely at its base. Watson, he said, Do you recall our encounter at the Hotel Tisa? You mean that miserable fortnight in Belgrade with the intercepted telegraph codes and the colonel who faked his own kidnapping? The very one. He held out the pawn for my inspection. See here, the base is carved with a small sigil, an eagle split at the wing. It means nothing to me. It is the house mark of Andor Fekete, a Hungarian craftsman who supplied an exclusive run of ebony chess sets to the Hotel Tisa in 1889. Only 12 were made. I saw one on the board during our stay and noted the mark then. You're saying this pawn is from that set? I'm saying it was never sold outside Belgrade, and that its sudden appearance on a London pillow is no accident. Holmes replaced it on the shelf with something like reverence. This piece, he murmured, crossed Europe to land in Rivington's room. Someone sent a message. Not merely a warning, but a signature. And what message is that? I asked. Holmes's gaze was fixed on the pawn. That the board is set, and the other player has already made his opening move. It was not until the following morning that Holmes, having spent half the night in meditation over pipe smoke and the unopened violin case, finally addressed me with something resembling gravity. I have not spoken this name in some time, he said, but I believe Lazar Petrovich is in London. The name stirred a faint echo in my memory. Petrovich, the intelligence broker. I recall your mention of him in passing during the Montenegro affair. He is not a broker, Watson. He is a strategist, a saboteur by education, fluent in 7 languages and 17 dialects. He leaves no fingerprint, no signature, save for one. The chess piece. Holmes nodded. He once embedded a knight in a hollow brick wall in Sarajevo. It was found 5 months later, after the depot exploded. I had him once in Subotica, but he vanished across the Sava under false credentials. And you think he's resurfaced here? I think he never left. He has watched, waited, and now that someone has tampered with Rivington's draft and planted an unmistakable mark, Petrovich has declared himself once more. But why reveal himself now? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Because, my dear Watson, he believes no one is watching, and in that belief, he has made his first mistake. Holmes remained seated for some time after mentioning Petrovich's name, his gaze cast not on me, but somewhere just above the hearth, as though watching an invisible scene replay upon the walls of Baker Street. At length he said, "There is a reason, Watson. You never wrote of the affair at Novi Sad." I blinked. You forbade me. And for good reason. There are corners of Europe where the name Holmes still inspires an inconvenient scrutiny. He drew in a breath. Petrovich was then believed to be operating under the alias Kolya Radin. We tracked a series of forged requisition slips and misrouted artillery carriages, each one designed to delay movement across the Danube frontier. I came within hours of apprehending him. Indeed, I had him cornered in a ruined monastery above the Tisa Bend. What happened? Holmes's mouth drew in a straight line. He escaped by smoke, confusion, and a local contact I had underestimated. I lost 3 good hours and nearly lost my life. I said nothing. He is not like Moriarty, Holmes continued softly. Petrovich works not for profit, but for shift, for sway. He does not wish to destroy the empire. He merely wishes to misalign it, quietly, permanently. And this map? This map is not the end, Holmes said. 'Tis the beginning of another move. Later that day, I noticed Holmes slipping a folded sheet into an envelope, sealing it with wax and affixing a single red sticker to the upper left corner. He said nothing of its contents, nor did he mark it with a return address. He handed it to me as I passed through the study. Be so good as to see this reaches the government telegraph office on Pall Mall. It is to be transmitted under Section Violet. I paused mid-step. Violet? Holmes nodded. Mycroft will understand. The tone in his voice was one I had heard only a handful of times before. Calm, clipped, but bearing the unmistakable weight of national gravity. He did not need to explain. Messages under the violet classification were not routed through the standard bureaus. They bypassed civil channels entirely and entered a realm of decision-making where silence held more weight than votes. As I prepared to leave, he added, almost absently, "If you're stopped, say nothing of the name Petrovich, not even to the undersecretaries." "Are we truly so deep, Holmes?" He looked at me then. "We are not yet deep, Watson, but the water is rising." That evening was among the strangest I recall in our Baker Street chronicles, not for what occurred, but for what did not. Holmes, who might ordinarily have busied himself with a monograph or lulled his thoughts with the violin, chose instead to do nothing at all. He paced. From the fireplace to the window and back again, his hands clasped behind his back, his gait precise and mechanical. He refused supper, waved off my offer of a cigar, and when I laid the violin case open beside him, he closed it gently without a word. "Are you expecting him?" I asked at last. "No," Holmes replied. "I am expecting his next move." "Petrovich!" Holmes nodded, but did not elaborate. The lamps flickered with the pulse of the city beyond our glass, and I found myself, against reason, checking the locks twice. "Shall I sit up with you?" I asked. Holmes stopped only long enough to offer a small smile. "No need, Watson. You are my doctor, not my watchdog." But I did not sleep. Something in the quiet was pressing too heavily upon the air. It must have been near midnight when Holmes ceased his pacing. He had taken a position by the window, one arm resting on the sill, eyes drawn not to the street below, but to the reflection in the glass. "Watson," he said without turning, "do you see the man near the lamp-post?" I moved beside him. A figure stood just beyond the arc of the nearest gaslight, a cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. "I do." He has stood there for 23 minutes and has not moved more than an inch. He wears shoes 2 sizes too large for his frame and turns his head only when carriages pass. "You think—" "I know," Holmes replied quietly. "That is not Petrovich. That is the man Petrovich sent to watch us." He straightened, "which means Petrovich is no longer behind the curtain. He is on the stage." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Holmes looked at me finally. "It is time we moved from defence to attack, my dear Watson. The pawn is in motion, and before long he will be the king." Holmes was in a curiously cheerful mood as he placed the final touches on what he termed the bait. I watched with mingled admiration and uncertainty as he smoothed the edges of the parchment, adjusted the ink to match the subtle inconsistencies of the forgery, and folded it with the care of a jeweller sealing a velvet case. "It must be convincing," he said, "but not too perfect. We want the thief to believe he's interrupted a private, unguarded moment, not stumbled into a museum display." The map bore Rivington's altered lines in precisely the manner we had seen in the corrupted draft, routes diverging subtly from real-world geography, depot names deliberately blurred or misplaced, and junctions shifted to compromise key supply nodes. "Is it wise to leave it here?" I asked, "even as a trap?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "That depends, Watson, on whether one views a spider's web as an invitation or a snare. Rivington had been instructed to leave London for the evening and to tell no one, not even his landlord, of his departure. A decoy suitcase was left by his door, its handle worn just enough to suggest hurried travel. The fewer truths our enemies can count on, Holmes said, the more likely they are to reveal themselves by trying to confirm one. The parlour of Rivington's lodging was small, sparsely furnished, and uncomfortably warm due to a fire Holmes insisted be lit, if only for realism. Inspector Lestrade had joined us just after dusk, bringing with him the peculiar mixture of suspicion and admiration that he always reserved for Holmes's schemes. "Are we quite certain," he whispered, "that the bait will be taken tonight?" Holmes gave a quiet shrug. "Only as certain as one can be when dealing with men who write in ink meant never to be seen." We had extinguished all but a single candle, which flickered in a far corner beneath a low lampshade. Holmes had positioned the false map at the centre of Rivington's desk, as though left behind in haste. The effect was one of carelessness, just enough to tempt. Time passed slowly. The candle's flame shortened. Lestrade began to fidget. Holmes remained still, crouched low near the bookshelf, his eyes fixed on the doorway with the patience of a predator. I confess my nerves were less disciplined, and at one point I found myself silently reciting an old surgical catechism to steady my hands. Then Holmes raised one finger, silently, sharply. Outside, on the stairwell, came the creak of leather on wood, and a breath too deliberate to be accidental. The sound was unmistakable, someone ascending the staircase with deliberate care, as though measuring each step against the night's silence. Holmes had described Petrovic's gait as even, unhurried, and firm, but this approach bore hesitation, a limp masked with effort. Weight shifted unevenly. Holmes turned towards me, just briefly, his expression unreadable but alert. The doorknob turned without a sound. Whoever was on the other side had oiled it. A pause. Then the door inched open. A figure slipped inside. A man of medium build, his features partially obscured by the shadow of a travel cap. He moved with the tension of a man trained to enter unfamiliar rooms quickly, his eyes scanning every surface before settling on the desk. He approached the bait. Holmes gave no signal. We waited. The intruder reached into his coat, withdrew a folded cloth, and laid it beside the map. Then, without touching it, he crouched and began to study it under a pocket magnifier. Holmes rose then, slowly, deliberately. "That will do, Major Hensley," he said. "The act is complete." The man spun around, startled, but not, I noted, shocked. His expression was one of bitter resignation rather than fear. "So you know," he muttered. Holmes stepped forward. "We know. We've known since the clerk called you sir, and you did not object." Lestrade lit the second lamp, and the fuller light revealed the intruder's features. Older than I had guessed, perhaps 45, with a military moustache and a scar across his temple that he made no effort to conceal. His coat, though plain, had been tailored in a fashion more common to officers on half-pay than civilians. His boots were worn at the heel, but polished with evident care. There was something in the uprightness of his spine that still betrayed discipline, however diminished. "Major Elric Hensley," Holmes said evenly, "once of the Royal Engineers, cashiered after the Belgrade affair in '89. Since then, you've changed your name as often as your address, but your handwriting, unlike Rivington's, has always leaned slightly to the left." Hensley's jaw tightened. "I committed no crime in Belgrade." "No," Holmes agreed, "but you lost a great deal at the baccarat table, and more at the tables that followed. Debt is its own master." Lestrade stepped forward. "On whose orders, Hensley? You didn't come here for a forged map out of patriotic duty." Hensley gave a mirthless smile. "Do you suppose a man like me has the luxury of motive, Inspector? When you owe what I owe, to whom I owe it, you act, or you vanish." Holmes raised his brows. "And whom do you serve now?" But Hensley said nothing more. Lestrade placed him under arrest for unlawful entry and possession of forged defence documents. Hensley did not resist. As he was led from the room, Holmes turned to me. "He was never the architect, Watson, merely the courier." "And the chessboard?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the window. "Now we wait for the hand that moved the piece. There are moments when instinct outruns reason, and mine, I dare say, acted before I quite grasped the danger." Hensley's eyes had darted towards the window only for the briefest second, yet in Holmes's silence I had learned to read volumes in such glances. The Major's hand slid to his coat as though adjusting it, but instead he twisted sharply and lunged toward the sill. I moved with an alacrity that surprised even myself. My shoulder met his flank with the full weight of my frame behind it. There was a crash, a clatter, and the two of us tumbled to the floor amidst a scatter of embers and shattered crockery. Hensley gave a grunt of pain, and before he could right himself, I had his wrist pinned against the rug. Lestrade was upon us in the next moment, snapping handcuffs into place with professional efficiency. "Well done, Doctor," he muttered. "Didn't know you had it in you." Truth be told, neither did I. Holmes, however, did not rise. He remained seated, hands steepled, the faintest shadow of amusement touching the corners of his mouth. "Very neatly executed, Watson," he said, though I fear the true player is still 2 steps behind him. Holmes had refused to move from the armchair he'd occupied since dusk, draped as he was in a worn shawl, a cane resting nearby, and a faint flush artfully applied to his cheeks with a dab of rouge. I had been puzzled earlier by the affectation, but now the purpose crystallized. He had been bait for more than one fish in this pond. Lestrade, brushing ash from his collar, glanced toward him with mild irritation. "You might have warned us the man would bolt, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "He didn't bolt, Inspector. He performed precisely as expected, an unconvincing imitation of panic, designed to signal that the game is ending, but the end game, I assure you, is only now beginning." I looked from the man bound on the floor to the window, which still stood open to the night. "Do you believe he was being watched?" Holmes gave the faintest nod. Watched, and watched for. Now that the pawn has been played and captured, the king must act. He sank deeper into the chair, folding his hands across his chest. "Now, Watson," he murmured with a half smile, "we wait." We had waited scarcely 20 minutes before the unmistakable rumble of wheels broke the hush outside. Lestrade moved to the window, peering past the curtains. "A coach," he whispered. "No insignia, no lanterns. Driver's face is muffled." Holmes's eyes remained shut, but his voice emerged clear and cold. "He is punctual. Petrovich always was." The carriage door opened with a soft click. A figure alighted, tall, lean, the stoop of age offset by a precision in movement that betrayed calculation, not frailty. He walked with a pronounced limp, his cane tapping once on each third step. His hat was low, his overcoat immaculate, and from the way he paused at the door, I knew Holmes's trap had not gone unnoticed. Still, he entered. The parlour's door creaked, and there stood Lazar Petrovich, former attaché, reputed linguist, and as Holmes once whispered to me during a midnight train through Montenegro, the most dangerous man who never fired a shot. Petrovich surveyed the room in silence. His eyes settled on Hensley, then drifted to Holmes. "Ah," he said with a quiet nod. "The English chessboard." Holmes opened his eyes. "You're 2 hours early." "I learned," Petrovich said with a thin smile, "never to arrive at the time my enemies expect." "Which is why you are always late," Holmes replied. They regarded one another like players who had known each other's strategy for decades. Then Holmes whispered, "Check." Petrovich did not flinch, but I saw his knuckles tighten on the curved handle of his cane. "Such melodrama," he said. "I came only to retrieve a friend." Holmes rose then, abandoning all pretense of infirmity, and in 3 steps stood between Petrovich and the door. "The map you came for is false. The courier has confessed. The ink on the forgery was Ottoman scented with saffron oil, used only by 3 printers in Europe. One of them," he said coolly, "used to prepare your diplomatic correspondence." Petrovich inclined his head. "You deduced all that from the ink?" Holmes did not smile. "From the ink, yes. But I confirmed it from the absence of surprise in your eyes when you saw the room. When you saw me." Petrovich sighed. "You've grown sharper." Holmes stepped aside only slightly, a silent cue to Lestrade. "I laid the final move 2 days ago," Holmes said. "The rest was patience. I knew you could never resist a board with one piece unguarded." Petrovich turned toward the inspector. "Shall I surrender my cane as well?" he asked. Lestrade, uncharacteristically gentle, nodded. "Yes, if you would." Petrovich handed it over with the grace of a gentleman passing a gift across a dining table. "Doctor," Holmes said to me, "you may wish to write this one down someday, but not until the board gives its blessing." I nodded. though I already knew I would. The arrests were carried out with the sort of quiet formality that comes when a case ends, not with fury, but inevitability. Hensley and Petrovich were led away without resistance. The latter even offered Lestrade a small bow, as though in acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. Holmes said little on our cab ride back to Baker Street. He seemed, as he often did after a difficult game, more pensive than pleased. Only when we had settled by the hearth once more, he with his pipe, I with my notes, did he speak. "Did you notice," he murmured, "how the entire plan hinged on two assumptions? That we would overestimate Hensley and underestimate the ink. You deduced both," I said. "Yet you never told me." Holmes smiled faintly. "If I told you everything, Watson, how would I delight in your astonishment?" We both laughed, but there was something sombre behind his eyes. "You seem troubled," I ventured. He tapped ash from his pipe. "Because the moves were predictable, and when even a man like Petrovich becomes predictable, I fear what that says about the game." "But you won," I offered. Holmes looked toward the window, where the gas lamps outside flickered like chessmen on a distant field. "Yes," he said softly, "but the game is never without risk, and sometimes the knight removed was meant to protect the queen." It was a remark I pondered long after he had gone silent again. The hour had grown late by the time Lestrade returned from delivering his prisoners into official hands. Holmes, having exchanged his feigned invalid's garb for his more usual dressing gown, sat cross-legged by the hearth, a single candle flickering at his side. I, too, had resumed my place in the armchair, though my mind was far from restful. Lestrade, damp from the mist and faintly irritated from the paperwork, shook his head. "It's always the ones you don't suspect." Holmes exhaled a slow stream of smoke and regarded him with a half smile. "On the contrary, Inspector, Major Hensley was precisely the man we were meant to suspect. It was his only purpose." He tapped the ash from his pipe and folded his long fingers. "Petrovich," he began, "has always preferred misdirection to confrontation. Why steal a secret when one can falsify it more elegantly? But to do so required two players, one visible, one invisible. Hensley's role was to be seen and suspected. He was the sacrificial pawn. And Petrovich, I asked. Holmes's eyes glittered. "The hand that moved the pieces." Lestrade leaned forward. "But how did you know?" Holmes rose to pour himself a small brandy. "Shall we draw back the curtain, gentlemen? The performance is over." And so began one of those quiet, thrilling hours I cherish most, Holmes pacing slowly, explaining the case from silence into light, as only he could. "The first clue," Holmes began, warming his hands by the fire, "was not in what was written, but in what was used to write it." I nodded. "The Ottoman ink." "Precisely. A saffron-based ink favoured by scribes in Constantinople and certain Balkan diplomatic channels. Our friend Rivington's genuine maps, of course, used standard British ink. Low acidity, no fragrance. But the forged sheet bore a faint floral scent, not unlike cardamom, and the paper curled slightly when warmed. That, my dear Watson, indicated a foreign origin." Lestrade frowned. "And the curtain," Holmes smiled. "The parlour curtain in Rivington's flat bore a streak of fine soot. Not from candle smoke, but from chimneys. Someone had drawn it aside with fingers darkened by rooftop work. The soot was fresh, still smudged. Our forger had entered not through the door, but down the flue. A method that explains the absence of lock tampering." "And the wax?" "That," Holmes said, "was almost poetic. A half-print left on the skirting board beside the bureau bore a faint sheen, Belgravia boot polish, no longer manufactured since February of this year. I happen to know only 3 men who still insist upon its use." "One of whom is Petrovich?" I asked. "Indeed. He's fastidious in appearance. His walking shoes, I've noted before, are always lacquered with an old-world thoroughness. The Polish contained castor oil and myrrh. Both leave a residue visible only under gaslight. Lestrade let out a low whistle. That's thorough. Holmes gave a thin smile. I do my best, Inspector. But what precisely was the object? I asked. Surely a single map cannot bring down the Empire. Holmes turned toward me with a look I had learned to interpret as faint disappointment. Not in me, but in the limitations of ordinary logic. The map, he said, was not meant to be stolen. It was meant to be found. Lestrade looked up. A planted fake? Exactly. Petrovic intended the forged document to be discovered by a junior clerk or an overzealous messenger. Its existence would then cast doubt on Rivington's reliability, or worse, redirect an entire engineering initiative. One curved line on the map, only slightly off, would have diverted a planned rail tunnel into unstable soil near the Welsh border. I blinked. That could have caused a collapse. A collapse, Holmes echoed, and the delay of a critical military transport route. The map would then be blamed on British error. Meanwhile, the real one, safeguarded elsewhere, would be quietly destroyed. Lestrade muttered, That's not espionage, that's sabotage. Holmes gave a grim nod. Sabotage of the most elegant kind, invisible, bloodless, and deniable. But for a single thread of Ottoman ink and a soot-smudged curtain, it might have succeeded. He fell silent for a moment, then added, almost to himself, Sometimes, Watson, a lie must look exactly like the truth in order to be believed, and therein lies the art. Holmes, still with his back half turned to the hearth, now shifted just enough to glance at us both. You see, he began, Petrovic had no interest in personal glory. That makes him far more dangerous than men who act from greed or vengeance. He merely wanted the board to shift beneath our feet. He took up the fire tongs and nudged a coal with absent care. To that end, he used Major Elric Hensley, a man once decorated, now disgraced. Debts on the continent, a taste for cards, and a tendency to drink his way through honour. Such men make perfect pawns. Hensley was useful precisely because he was disposable. Petrovic's stroke of genius, Holmes continued, lay in choosing a man who could not afford to ask questions. Hensley was given forged instructions, a new identity, and a boarding house address. He believed he was assisting some vague cause, perhaps revenge for the Balkans or a smuggled contract. He knew only what Petrovic allowed him to know. Lestrade, who had seated himself, gave a snort, and all the while, the cripple with the cane walks past the guards like a pensioner. Exactly, Holmes said. The man who limps is rarely suspected of running. I could not help but marvel and shudder. To use a man's ruin as camouflage, and do so with such surgical precision, it was chess with human souls. And the trap? I asked, though the pieces were beginning to glint in my mind like glass under moonlight. Holmes folded his hands. Petrovic fancied himself a chess master. I merely obliged him a game. He stood and paced slowly before the hearth. The forged map was always going to be used. What Petrovic could not have foreseen was that I'd intercept it, duplicate it precisely, and mark the replica ever so subtly. One faint horizontal line across a hill ridge, meaningless to any but myself. A baited hook dangling just where the current would take it. I frowned. And the telegram? A lure, Holmes replied. I placed a coded message in the Times, phrased innocently, but phrased in such a way that anyone watching Rivington's habits would interpret it as a signal to act. I wished to flush the agent. The only risk was whether Petrovic would come himself or send another pawn, and Rivington's departure. Holmes allowed himself a brief smile. Necessary theatre. I instructed him to vanish for one evening, boarding a Brighton-bound train under an alias. I even ensured he dropped his hat at Victoria Station, a detail certain to be reported back. Lestrade raised his brows. You played both sides of the board. Holmes's eyes glinted. I merely ensured the game ended with white in checkmate. As the firelight dwindled, Holmes returned to the subject of Rivington's work with a rare tone, not of deduction, but of appreciation. Most men, he said, seek to hide secrets by burying them in noise, too much ink, too many markings. The modern mind has come to associate secrecy with confusion. He tapped a finger on the map now resting across his lap. Rivington did the opposite. His draft omitted every unnecessary stroke. No decorative border, no redundant scale, just the bare truth. Elevation, gradient, and velocity curves, and all rendered with such balance that one might mistake it for something unfinished. But therein lies the brilliance, he continued. To the untrained eye, it says little. To a strategist, however, to a man seeking weaknesses in terrain or blind spots for movement, it says everything. That map whispered where others shouted, and that is why Petrovich feared it. I looked at the engineer's modest pencil-drawn document and felt, not for the first time, that the most powerful weapons are often made not of steel, but silence. Later that evening, Rivington returned. His collar was askew, and his eyes bore the weight of unspoken anxiety. He entered hesitantly, as though uncertain whether he had been the hero or the fool. Holmes offered no flourish. He merely gestured to the armchair and poured a second brandy. "You did well," he said simply. "Very few men can leave a baited line dangling without tugging it." Rivington gave a weak smile. "I kept asking myself if I'd done the right thing." Holmes considered this a moment. It is a peculiar aspect of loyalty that it often feels indistinguishable from cowardice. But to stand still, to say nothing, when every instinct urges you to shout, that requires discipline. He leaned back, fingers steepled. The men who shout and wave flags are not always the ones who serve. You, Mr. Rivington, chose silence. You chose not to run to Whitehall or press your credentials upon the nearest colonel. You let the work speak, and let me listen. The engineer lowered his gaze. "I only wanted to protect the integrity of what I made." Holmes gave a small nod. "And you did. By refusing to play the hero, you became something rarer, a true servant of your country's interests." For a moment, there was no sound but the soft hiss of coal. Just as the final logs dimmed in the grate, and Rivington rose to leave, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a silver tray. Upon it lay a single folded telegram. Holmes opened it with his usual indifference, though I noticed his brow lift slightly as he read. "Well?" I asked. He passed it to me without a word. It read, "Petrovich traced to Trieste. Bishop moves. Knight waits." It bore no signature, but the location, Pall Mall, and the cryptic tone were unmistakable. Mycroft. Lestrade peered over my shoulder. "That's not exactly helpful." "On the contrary," Holmes murmured. "It tells me precisely what I need to know." He moved to the window and looked out at the misty gaslights of Baker Street. "The bishop moves," he repeated. "That would be our missing financier in Vienna. And the knight, yes, I believe I know who that refers to." He turned back, an odd smile on his lips. "We may be playing on a wider board than I imagined." Lestrade sighed. "Are we ever off the board, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes reached for his pipe again. "Only when we allow others to make our moves for us." He struck a match, then said, almost wistfully, "Come, Watson, there's fog in Trieste, and a shadow I'd like to chase." It was a curious sort of silence that lingered in our sitting room that morning, one not born of fatigue, but of something subtler, the mental hush that follows the resolution of a problem, whose moral weight refuses to be shelved with the evidence. Outside, the fog of the previous evening had lifted, giving way to pale shafts of light that glanced across the breakfast table. Yet, within me, there remained a lingering shadow. Holmes sat in his armchair, his toast untouched, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The fire had burned low, and I found myself resenting the cheerful crackle that had so often marked our morning interludes. I stirred my tea twice without sipping, my thoughts drifting once more to Rivington, the modest engineer, whose quietude had nearly redirected the arc of Britain's military fate. "There are games," I said at last, "that leave one more unsettled by the winning than the losing." Holmes said nothing, but the faintest smile curved his lips, that familiar, unreadable expression that told me he had already reached the end of a line of thought I had only just begun. It struck me, not for the first time, how unremarkable Rivington appeared. Slight, hesitant, the kind of man one might pass in the street without the least notice, and yet he had held in his possession the power to misdirect fleets, expose strategic rail lines, and compromise months of national planning, all with a few strokes of a pencil. There is, perhaps, a particular kind of courage in those who wield no weapon, command no troops, and yet shoulder responsibility that would leave a lesser man gasping. Rivington's loyalty was not theatrical. It was not shouted from rooftops or worn upon his sleeve. It was stitched into the fabric of his restraint, in what he chose not to reveal, even when every nerve in his body must have screamed for relief. Such men, I thought, leave no statues behind, but nations are held together by precisely their kind. Holmes had resumed his solitary game, a languid war between white and black whose outcome seemed of interest to no one but himself. He moved a bishop with deliberate grace, then paused, studying the board with a faraway look. "Tell me, Watson," he said softly, "have you ever noticed how it is rarely the pawn who gives the game away?" I made no reply. "It is the bishop," he continued, "or the knight, the piece that moves diagonally or deceptively, whose path is not always as it seems. Move it too early and the balance falters." He gestured faintly. "Petrovich moved too soon. The bishop betrayed the strategy, and in doing so, he allowed me to see the shape of the board." I leaned forward. "And what of the queen?" Holmes smiled, but his gaze remained fixed. "Ah, she too has her uses, but even queens can be sacrificed, if the checkmate is inevitable." Some minutes later, Holmes rose and crossed to the corner where his violin had rested untouched these many weeks. He plucked the strings once, adjusted the bridge, and then, with the gentlest of gestures, began to play. The notes were neither joyful nor sombre, only thoughtful, like a question without an answer. And in that moment, I understood that the public would never know. No parliament would debate it. No medals would be struck. The names would fade, as the ink had faded on the forged map. And perhaps, I thought, that anonymity was the purest reward a patriot might hope for. Holmes ceased playing, and with a glance at the folded map upon the table, remarked dryly, "It is odd, is it not, Watson, that the smallest fragment of paper may redraw the fate of nations, and yet men will lose sleep over it all the same." I looked from the fire to the board, where a pawn stood defiantly, where once the queen had reigned. He had let her go 4 moves ago, sacrificed her without hesitation. I shook my head and smiled, not without a sigh. "He sacrificed the queen to checkmate a pawn," I muttered. Typical Holmes. Holmes remained still for some time after the telegram had been read, the fire casting flickers against the violin now resting in his lap. Then, with the faintest trace of amusement in his voice, he remarked, "Curious, is it not, Watson, how the most decisive battles of our age are waged not with bullets, but with the careful omission of ink?" He turned his eyes to the window, where the morning light had at last begun to conquer the fog. "In the end, it is not the roar of cannons, but the silence of maps, that truly shifts empires." I glanced at him, unsure whether he was speaking of the case, of Rivington, or of something altogether more personal. Perhaps, as with so much of Holmes, all three were one and the same. "What do you think? Was it the forged line, or the quiet man behind it that truly held the power to change the fate of a nation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd be fascinated to read your deductions. And if you enjoyed unraveling this case with us, do subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries and share this story with fellow lovers of classic deduction. The game, as ever, is far from over.